Hi, I'm Julia Hare, and today we're talking about grocery.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Kinney. I look after our customer and market intelligence team for Albertsons as a vice president of enterprise analytics.
Excellent. And Lisa, I'm really glad to have you here today, especially with the analytics background that you bring to the table. Every year we do this report, and I want to dive in with our biggest question, what people are most curious about. What are the biggest trends that are on your radar?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's certainly a lot that I would suspect is top of mind for whomever you speak to, whether it's someone who's more of an internal consultant to others that might be running operations or marketing. I think you're going to find some pretty common themes. Of course, we're going to have to start with the digital world that's quickly changed the landscape and how shoppers shop, how we consume product inspiration, how we monetize those customer touch points. So I think that's been the buzz for a while, but I think that you can't help but probably every other week hear of some retailer launching retail media. So we can dig into that a little bit later on, watch outs and pain points. But trends that I'm hearing and I don't think have gone away, but have become more pervasive is obviously the omnichannel shopping experience. The expectations now for more seamless, frictionless experiences is now table stakes. I think earlier on, several years ago, where maybe some retailers were a bit behind in building out that capability, had a little more forgiveness with their customers. And now that, all retailers are offering great experiences, the tolerance level for poor experiences is pretty low. By 2023, I think I heard something that said, 25% of grocery retail sales are expected to be through the e-commerce channel. We know Europe is certainly a little further ahead in adoption. So definitely, I don't think that trend's going to go away anytime soon. I think another big trend is really around channel proliferation that we're experiencing. I think you're going to hear, if you haven't heard, you'll hear more of it, is, the choices, and not only in how you want to get your groceries served to you, whether it's online or in store or a combination of both, but certainly where you fulfill those needs has transformed very rapidly as we see consumers in their quest for value. So, I think maybe 10 years ago, we would have all talked about conventional retailers being, the mom on Saturdays that does their weekly shop. And that stock up mission is, pretty much tried and true for a traditional grocer. And I think what we're seeing and what most grocery shopping is illustrating is really a fragmentation of all of those trips across multiple retailers and formats. And that's really been driven by a quest for value. It's interesting, though, that while there are pure play value retailers that we all can think of, and I tend to avoid naming names, but there are retailers that actually not only deliver value, but have been able to expand on that value equation, for lack of a better word, with different experiences. Think of like the treasure hunt experience that also has a great value on top of that. Think about retailers that may not have been who you would consider having the best fresh produce and meat, certainly have upped their table stakes and actually are being considered more for large stock up trips than ever before. So that's a big dynamic that I think many retailers are going to have to address and talk about. I think another big topic is going to be supply chain disruptions that haven't quite really rebounded. There's now, an elevated emphasis on health and sustainability. I think we've all been talking about it for quite some time, but I would suspect that that's going to become even more of an emerging concern when we talk to customers and say what's top of mind and what are your fears, in life. Inflation and economy are 1 and 2, but with certain generations, actually mental health and well-being and sustainability actually rank number 3. So they are our future, spenders in the market. So I think that that's something all of us are going to have to take note of. I think finally, a few quick ones, and I'll talk quickly about that. Partnerships. So you're going to see, we see a lot of retailers that are enhancing their proposition through partnerships. We'll get into that potentially. Double down on convenience, inspiration, and value. We're all trying to do that in different ways as a grocery industry. I think the rate of inflation, we've talked a little bit about that in the quest for value. So those are kind of the big terrains that I think are macro trends that aren't going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you, Lisa. And you touched on quite a few. So, consumer behavior,
Mhm.
technology, partnerships, and a few others. I'd like to dive into the consumer behavior for a second.
Mhm.
I think we can all relate to that so much. And as a society, it's really interesting to hear you point out from the grocer's perspective the the slight difference where it's multiple shopping trips spread out over the week.
Mhm.
And that change seems maybe subtle, but to consumers, and it's obviously a huge impact on grocers and your ability to
Sure.
predict things. In the years past grocery report, people were saying, hey, with the advent of Instacart and the like, there's less opportunity for those impulse purchases in the aisle and for discovery.
Mhm.
And that's going to impact the incremental revenue. Do you think that's not true now that we've seen people are actually shopping more and potentially spending more because of the greater amount of trips that they're making, even if it's digital?
I think that's a great question. And I think if you look at the total customer, that's very different than if you're looking at as a retailer, what can I get and what are my hurdles to growth inside my four walls, right? So I think, yes, there has always been a bit of concern as we all are trying to drive omni-channel adoption, that, oh my goodness, we're gonna miss that impulse buy. I think we have to look at it a little bit differently in that um, my work has shown, and I think other retailers that study, household behavior and data, and you can really dig in underneath it all. It's actually when you get them to trust you with that second channel, with that e-commerce experience, you're actually increasing their overall spend with you. They're stickier, which means you're retaining them, and you're really actually winning share of a consideration set, if that makes sense. So you're actually um, winning that trip that they would have otherwise chosen a different retailer for. So once you can get them in, the incrementality is quite high. And I think it far negates the risk of in-store purchases or impulse buys. I would say over time, what's going to be interesting is as that regimen grows, right? And you have people that finally just love the convenience of online. I can speak to my daughter being one where she's like, why would I ever go inside a store? Yes, there's going to be probably a small population base where they completely shift their entire channel preference to be fully digital. And that's where the world of technology and inspiration and social commerce and all the other things that can connect with customers digitally really are going to have to play a role. I think we talk a little bit. I had some notes on that as I was thinking about this era. And um, I'm only on TikTok not because I'm certainly trying to create content, but I certainly want to understand kind of what people are consuming. And you can see it. Like there are, come to this retailer and look at my favorite finds. And there's kind of this emerging social influence that talks about
Mm-hmm.
experiences and can actually drive a person to the store from a sense of scarcity, or I want to go try that gnocchi, that's this flavor that you're only going to have this month. So I think there's other ways to drive experience in the store, but digital is going to be the way to do it.
Absolutely. And with digital, I think grocers have been traditionally pre-COVID a little bit behind the curve when it comes to technology,
Mhm.
and that's completely flipped on its head. So with
Yep.
that, there's been so many challenges. What are the challenges going into 2025 that you would prioritize for tackling?
Oh, and I think that's a hard because I tend to present a lot of challenges and opportunities, and then I'm always asked that tough question of like, well, Lisa, which one are you going to ask us? Which one should we solve for first, second, and
Well,
third, and what should keep us up at night, and which one should we just worry about but not lose sleep over? And that's a hard question. I would say what I think are going to be some of the biggest challenges is going to be about driving differentiation. I hate to say it, but I think what we as retailers, depending on the retailer you're talking to, believed we had a position of strength, whether it be our footprint and it being very convenient, or whether it's a retailer that's like, I'm a value player and I can, this is where they're going to go for that. I think it's your strength is someone else's opportunity. So I think that that is going to be something that I think I will always be thinking about is where is our differentiation? What is our distinctiveness? What are we great at that we need to do, be so much better than anyone else that there's no reason to ever go anywhere else? And so I think that that's going to be even more difficult. I do think there's another piece that I'm not sure I'm losing sleep over, but we need to start thinking about it, which is the retail media landscape. Every retailer is in the space of monetization of, consumer touch points. And I do wonder it, when we will get to a point where you're over exhausting customers relative to impressions. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. And at what point is there going to be a pressure point for all retailers to start thinking about, is retail media a means to an end, or is it an enabler to a strategy? Because I think it needs to be an enabler to a bigger strategy. And I think really just, I talked about this on differentiation, but just having a true brand equity, having actually an equity with customers is going to be even more and more challenging. And I think all grocery retailers are going to have to solve for that. I do think obviously cost, supply chain, all of those things are day to day that everyone needs to worry about. But those are some big things that I'm tackling right now.
Those are big things to
Yeah.
tackle, but you probably speak for a lot of the industry in regards to the changes of the lack of clarity and the blurred lines between the category or the niche that you're
Mhm.
filling in the grocery market. So that's really illuminating to hear you speak about. And it brings me to our next question in a seamless way, because that is about technology. Are there key technologies that will support or that you're looking at for some of those goals of differentiating yourself in the minds of
Mhm.
consumers?
I think I'm going to have to talk in more of a general sense versus specifically at Albertsons,
Sure.
uh, but I would say the the need to connect data and to create a more connected data attribute that is privacy compliant, that enables personalization, not only in who you talk to, but the content you render, the platforms that you're serving it to. The good news is that the data is available and it's there, and we've solved for all of the privacy guidelines that any retailer needs to adhere to. But what comes with that is a cost of computing that nobody really talks about, right? So there's a ton of cloud services out there that have different cost structures. One might be how long you're in the cloud. One might be, the amount of data that you're pulling out of the environment. And I think those commercial constructs for data processing and cloud environments are going to actually have implications on, well, do we really need to run that code? Like, do we really need to have that answer? That's going to cost us, $1,000 to write that query. And I know it's crazy. Probably nobody thinks about it. I do from time to time. Like, wait a minute. How is this going to change the way we think about the cost for personalization or the cost for just basic fundamental analytics? Because the more data we have, the more costly it is. You've got to store it somewhere. You've got to process it somewhere. So I think that that is something that a lot of companies probably are looking at. I would also say, from a technology perspective, supply chain. Again, most people yawn when you talk about supply chain, but
Yeah.
supply chain is super important because all of your trending that's happened pre-COVID were pretty stable, and you had a pretty strong predictive capability on replenishment. And guess what? All of those models that were built 10 years ago no longer apply. So there's definitely some supply chain optimization opportunities. And I think also, believe it or not, technology around labor planning, and
Mm-hmm.
actually workforce planning and hiring is going to become increasingly important. Probably not nearly as sexy as the first that I mentioned, but definitely that's going to play a role for sure.
All great points. Again, you covered a good amount of territory, and I like that you pointed out the privacy layer, which is very important, is in many ways taken care of by most retailers. And now there's this looming elephant in the room about whether or not the cost will be prohibitive for some of the big
Mm-hmm.
goals that grocers want to go after, especially with the margins, and will that cost ultimately get
Yeah.
passed down to the consumer?
Yeah.
Um, so I think you touched on a lot of things of what shouldn't we talk about or what isn't talked about enough. Are there
Mm-hmm.
any other ones that you wanted to add?
Yes, I'm so glad you actually reminded me of this point. What isn't being talked about enough is um, the role of inflation and how that makes its way to a customer on the shelf. I think that retailers tend to be viewed as like the ones pocketing the money, and they're like, we are probably one of the thinnest margin sectors in the industry as a grocery retailer.
Yeah.
So I think that what we don't talk a lot about is all of the other costs that go into putting a grocery item on the shelf, delivering it to a consumer, the role that CPGs play, and the cost and pricing dynamics in the marketplace. Just don't see a lot of people talking about it, right? So I think that there's a broader, probably education and a broader group of people getting together and figuring out how we're going to solve inflation and deliver value to customers that isn't an us versus them. It's not a retailer versus a CPG. It's got to be something done together, because we're both in it together, and the role we play is equal, in my opinion. So I think that there's something there that we need to talk about. I also think that the change management process, I love going to conferences. I speak in a few, and I hear a lot of vendors talk about tools and capabilities and this new data asset, but we never talk about what does it take to mobilize an organization around a new capability, a new partner. We don't really talk about the change management and the organization influence and design thinking that you need to build into the muscle to actually even harness this type of work or these types of tools and technologies. We just don't, because nobody wants to talk about like org
And why
design.
do you think
And
it is? Are we moving too fast? Is the subject not interesting? There's not enough resources to track the change management
I think
processes
it's
and
just
get
not
them out? What is
shiny.
it?
I think it's not
Yeah.
shiny. And I think that that's probably the last place people invest. Like, so we invest quite a bit on new ways to deliver information to organizations, um, new insights or analytic frameworks or even segmentation schemes that you want to and when I have a partner present to me like, oh, this new AI tool is going to be game changing, and I'm like, okay, what's the change plan? How are we going to mobilize? How are we going to train? How are we going to build confidence? And even just the basic, what customer metrics matter and what decisions do we make off of it? I think we all talk a lot about, I'm a customer centric organization. I'm not speaking on behalf of Albertsons in this example, but we're customer first, we're customer driven. And it's like, okay, well, what metrics do you actually hold people accountable for that are customer oriented? How do you, is, where does that trump financial metrics? Do you consider one an output to the other? And I think we just don't talk a lot about that because it's harder, a tool and buying a
Mhm.
tool is pretty easy. The hard part is really standing it up in a company and getting adoption.
Right. The fun part is at the start. um, those are interesting points. I think that it goes back to what you were saying a little bit about retail media
Mhm.
networks, and it's top of mind.
Yes.
Grocers are talking about it. It's a hot topic. It's shiny, but
Yep.
to your point, what's the strategy, and then how is that going to be implemented and measured across an
Yeah.
org? That seems to be a black box
Yep.
right now.
It is. And it's interesting because I do follow obviously how other retailers are organizing themselves. And, because that's part of my job is truly to um, drive organizational adoption of either a strategy or, an insight that we need to mobilize and actually purposefully action against. And even retail media to some extent, you start thinking about, okay, how are they organized? What have they learned? And you see a lot of changes. Some retailers, it's been standalone, and then they're like, that didn't work. We need to actually integrate. Sometimes it's its own entity with its own P&L that almost is branded as something separate from the retailer. Some are just outsourcing it entirely so that you're not competing for trade dollars in the CPG's mind, even though, a dollar's a dollar. So I think that I don't think anyone has quite solved for how does retail media insert itself in, not into the joint business planning process, but what is the role of retail media in solving a customer pain point that the company wants to tackle together? Like, what is the role of an ad being served up on an app or on a website? And how is that actually solving the needs of our customers? And I don't think that there's a lot of discipline around having those conversations, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is a good segue into the last question of today, which is about customer engagement and your take, if you're able to share on anything that's working well for Albertsons in terms of engaging the customer, or anything you have in terms of insights there.
Yeah, so I know I'll be cautious about how much I share on future growth strategies. I think understandably so. I'm sure you can imagine why. But I think that what we see working best is, and what I see working best, that's paid a lot of dividends for the business, is just that relentless focus on the customer. Really actually asking, what barrier are we trying to remove so that our shopper shops with us more? Like really literally putting ourselves in the shoes of the customer is something that I'm hearing the language change. I'm hearing the types of questions that are occurring in meetings being driven more from like how an empathy first oriented discussion around customer rather than a financial discussion. So that's actually working because it's helping us make better decisions. I think we've made tremendous headway on the friction and shopping experiences online. We've won some awards for having a great UX with our app. We've had some public announcements around our loyalty program and evolving that to make that less frictionless or more frictionless for customers. And I think that those are all things that are working. I think for me, I'll just simply state, knowing what our strengths are, what are our customers giving us credit for, really being okay with that and actually make it an even better. So kind of owning our distinctiveness so that we can win more of those first choices in the shopping journey rather than being the last choice in that whole mission, cycle for the week, is starting to pay quite a bit of dividends and actually helping us make some really customer first oriented decisions and strategies.
Well, I could hear it in your voice today and how you speak about the business, that customers are top of mind and quite literally everything that you're thinking about and doing. So it's definitely coming through, and it's a great shift to see. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Lisa, so much. And I hope to have you back again next year.
Wonderful. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.